I almost feel like we need a Johnny Carson style opening. Yeah, we're on. Hey everybody, welcome out there online. If you're joining us on YouTube, we're just getting some stuff ready for this morning. Big day today, good day. It's going to be a big month. We've got some exciting stuff going on. Things are opening up again, and it's good to see all of you here. I'm going to continue this lesson that I started last week about the nature of the Hebrews when they left Egypt and God took them to the promised land. They were brick makers. They were slaves, and God has to give them a new identity because they have a purpose. They are to be the people who represent God's ways to the rest of the world. See, there's a problem. When the Hebrews are in Egypt and they are slaves, they are not in the place that they need to be for the good of the rest of the world, because they need to be living out the kind of life, the kind of people, the kind of nation that follows the ways of God so that they can represent that to all of the world. And when that's not happening, then the decline that started after Genesis 3 is just going to continue. So we want to get a people who can demonstrate that to the world. Ultimately, they will set the stage then for the man, for the one who will demonstrate godly humanity to the rest of the world, and that's Jesus Christ. As the writer of Hebrews says, God in previous times has spoken to us through the prophets and maybe through angels, but now He speaks to us through His Son. He's revealed Himself in that one. That's my paraphrase. So this morning, we're going to take a look at Genesis, because part of what this lesson about brick makers becoming the people of God, part of what it's all about is about work and about rest. I wonder how many of you have had some experience with this over the last year, where our work patterns have changed, our ability to rest has changed. We're still limited in where we can go and where we can travel. Everybody's thinking about doing that, but there's still travel restrictions on many places in the world, or it just becomes very inconvenient to go to some places, especially if you're going to leave the United States. And our work patterns have changed because we've learned to work from home. We've learned to work at different times, and we're having to re-examine all of this. Part of the reason why it can be so confusing is that I don't think we honor the Genesis basis of what good work and good rest looks like. We get our ideas of good work and good rest not from Scripture, but from the culture around us way too often. There's this thing called the Protestant work ethic. And unfortunately, the Protestant work ethic has lost a lot of its connection to godly and spiritual principles. It just kind of has this, it's become kind of a generic American work ethic where the harder you work, the more you make. And that's a way to become a brick maker. I'm talking about a Pharaoh brick maker, even if you are the Pharaoh making yourself work like a slave. Because God did not make us for that kind of work. The Genesis story sets us up with a very important set of information. Let's take a look at Genesis 1 real quickly. We say the story's familiar. I'm not so sure it always is. It's good sometimes to come back to it and to see the little things that maybe we miss if we're just rushing through it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was without shape and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the watery deep. But the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light was good, so God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness night, and there was evening, and there was morning, marking the first day. On every one of these days, except for the seventh, God is going to, He's going to separate things out, He's going to give them purpose, and He's going to declare it good. Nothing is finished until He says, this is good. And then when we get to the seventh day in chapter 2, the heavens and the earth were completed with everything that was in them. And by the seventh day, God finished the work that He had been doing. How about that? God, He's a craftsman. He's a worker. He has a job. He creates. God has a work that He does. And in 6 days He works. It's completed. But there's one more day that is very important, and that's the seventh day. He ceased on the seventh day all the work that He had been doing. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it He ceased all the work that He had been doing in creation. Until He can have that day of rest, this creation really isn't complete. Until God can sit back and enjoy the creation that He's made, then this creation is not totally fulfilled. It tells us a few things. Number one, it tells us that it's not just enough that God made us and created us. You know, because if we hold simply to that, then we act like we don't need God anymore. We just abandon God. God got us here. Now we're on our own. That's the sort of thinking you come up with if God is creator and nothing more. So we were talking about NASA earlier. You know, the old rockets were so wasteful and you know, so brilliant but so wasteful, because it'd take a whole huge stage to get that little capsule up into space, and then what do you do with it? You jettison it and it goes back to Earth and it burns up. They've gotten a little better about that these days, but back in the days of Gemini and Apollo, that's the way they would do it. God is not something that gets us into existence and then we can abandon Him. The creation is not fulfilled until the creation understands its purpose to glorify and to worship and to be in a relationship with the Creator. So God creates us, but then we have to go back to Him and be blessed in the relationship with Him to understand what our work and purpose is all about. So God rests on that seventh day, and by resting, He blesses that seventh day. He makes it holy, and He ceases His work. And then we get into chapter 2, and we learn about God's connection and His relationship with these creatures, and especially with the man and the woman, and how He wants them to be creative and to create life and to thrive. So God rests, He enjoys His creation. We see good work and we see good rest. The day is holy, the day that we call the Sabbath, because in that we are imitating God. Working 6 days, resting 1. Working 6 days, resting 1. The Sabbath is like any of the other gifts that God gives us. It allows us to participate in what God is doing. Now, I know that it can be like, well, wait a second, are we still supposed to, keep the Sabbath? Are we still supposed to observe the Sabbath? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. Because when you see what Jesus taught us about the Sabbath, He said that the Sabbath was created for man, man was not created for the Sabbath. If we treat the Sabbath as a set of legalistic rules, and we focus so much on what we can and can't do, we will miss the point of the Sabbath. If we understand why God gave the gift of the Sabbath to these brickmakers, then regardless of whether it's a Saturday or a Sunday or another time, it will help us to appreciate what God was giving us the Sabbath for. He does give us the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, as something special. And the more that we can make it our Sabbath, the better off we all are. And as we're learning to come back to worship and gather together again, as we learned last year to gather at home, I think we were learning some things about patterns and coming together, that just coming together to come together is one thing, but coming together to honor God is very rewarding and very important, and it's very formational. So this is why God has to give this to these brickmakers. Now, when you're giving the Sabbath gift to the brickmakers, you have to understand, they wake up and every day is the same. They wake up and make the bricks. They wake up, they make the bricks. They wake up, they make the bricks. So to put them on a schedule where it's like you're going to work 6 days and you're going to do all sorts of things, not just make bricks, but I want you to take one day every 7 days and you're going to rest. That's going to be a shocker to them. That's like us going out of our routine and learning to do things online. But that disruption is what teaches. God rests, He enjoys His creation. There's no work on the Sabbath because God didn't work on the Sabbath. There's got to be a way to enjoy the things that we create, that we do. If we don't, then we run the risk of becoming brickmakers all over again. Humans in creation are overcoming the curse. Now this matters for this. Take a look with me at chapter 3. Verse 17. This is after the sin of Adam and Eve. They've disobeyed God. They did not respect His restrictions on. He gave them all the food they needed. He gave them work to do to tend the garden, and now they disobeyed that. So there are consequences. It's what's often called the curse. Curse just sounds so nasty because it almost sounds vindictive, but this is the way it has to be because they've changed the nature of the created order. There's going to be a consequence. This consequence shows up like this as God speaks it. He says, "Because you obeyed your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. The ground is now cursed because of you. In painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, but you will eat the grain of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat food until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you will return." This is not at all unsimilar from Romans 8. If you look at Romans 8, there's a connection here that I wonder if we catch sometimes. In Romans 8, Paul talks about the creation groaning, and it's in the pangs of childbirth, and he knows that something's going to change, and I think this is creation and us overcoming that curse. Chapter 8 of Romans, verse 19. "For the creation eagerly waits for the revelation of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of God who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will also be set free from the bondage of decay into the glorious freedom of God's children." In this chapter, Paul is looking at the curse or the consequences, not simply from the human side, but from the side of creation. You go back to Genesis 3, and God says the ground is cursed. We're not cursed. The ground is cursed. And not because the ground did anything, but because the human beings who are supposed to use it and tend to it and depend on it and rely on it, they did something. They abused it, and they abused the created order. And so now everyone suffers. And the creation, and from Paul's perspective, is just waiting for this to get set right. That we, the human beings who live here, will really be revealed as the children of God, the way it was with Adam and Eve. And then the ground gets to give up its curse. This is that relationship that we live in with the created order. And we are overcoming that when we rest. When we do good work and when we rest, we're overcoming that. You know, a lot of these principles that we're finding out today that you can't overwork the land. You know, not more than 100 years ago or so. Some of you will remember, or you'll remember people who have stories about this little thing that happened over here on the other side of the bridge in Oklahoma, where all the dirt just kind of picked up and blew away one day, right? And a lot of that happened because of the farming practices, and it was just destroying the soil, and the topsoil let go and let loose. And why were they doing that? Because they were making cash crops. They were planting things that would stir up the economy, but they ruined things. You ran it out in the process. Kind of reminds me of advice I got about cars when I was learning to drive. It was like, don't gun it, don't take off. You'll ruin your tires, you'll ruin your engine. You're not driving properly, and when you don't drive properly, you ruin your equipment. Well, it's the same way with the earth. When we overuse it, when we overwork it, what happens? It fails on us. Now, you don't have to be a Mother Earth worshiping environmentalist to accept any of that. That's just godly wisdom right there. That's the planet that God gave us, and we, as faithful stewards of that planet, will do well to take care of the things that we are given. I mean, these are time-honored values. You have to keep that in mind. God gives us that rest, and I think we would still do well to understand it, that not only do we rest, but we have to rest the things that He's given us. This is why the animals are supposed to be rested on the Sabbath. You don't get to overwork those animals either. They need to rest, or they're not going to last you. Creation looks forward to the true humans then in Romans 8. We mentioned that. So the purpose of Sabbath is a day of rest. It's a rest for us. It's a rest for the creation. This is why the animals get that rest. You read about this in the giving of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And the connection to the Sabbath is the creation event where God works 6 days, He rests one. So we're going to work 6 days, we're going to rest one. So many of the things that God gives us, it imitates God's behavior. Baptism, for example. Jesus Christ is crucified, He's buried, He's raised again. What happens to us in baptism? We participate and we imitate an act of burial and resurrection. It's connecting us to the experience of Jesus Christ in the gospel. When we have the Lord's Supper, we eat bread, we drink the fruit of the vine. Why? Because we are taking into ourselves the body and the blood of the Lord. His presence is with us. His presence is in us. We participate in this. And with baptism and the Lord's Supper, Jesus also experienced those things. He gave us the first Lord's Supper. He served His friends. He took it from them. He continues to serve at the table. He was baptized by John the Baptist. And so it is with Sabbath. Jesus taught us a lot about Sabbath too. He didn't just chuck it to the curb. He told us what it was really meant to be. And so when the Sabbath police show up, hey, you're not supposed to be picking grain on the Sabbath now. We don't do that. He's like, you don't understand the Sabbath. Sabbath isn't just about you and your rules. It's about you take care of the animals. You take care of yourself. Your livestock falls in a ditch, you go and get it out. Why? Because God made that. He made that, and you're going to take care of it. You're going to be kind to that poor livestock. Worship and work then would be something that I think that if we could discover that, we would understand how our spirituality and how our practice in church overlaps with our world of work, whatever it is that we do, whether it's our creative work, whether it's work that we do to make a living. You see, for most of us, we live in a worldview where the world is separated into two realms, not spiritual and physical, but religious and secular. And that is not a biblical separation. You're not going to find that in Scripture. But because of the age of the Enlightenment, because of our most recent history, and I'm talking about the last 200 to 300 years, you and I live with a worldview that sees the world as you've got your religious work and you've got your secular work. And we like to separate those out. And one of the reasons that we like to do that is not because that is somehow much more biblical, but because French philosophers and founding fathers in powdered white wigs thought that was a really good idea to keep the institutional corrupt church from getting into everybody's business. All right, now that's my simple take on it. It's a lot more complicated than that. But understand then that when we start to play with that separation, then things go awry. We become one kind of people at church and another kind of people out in the world. That all of our ethics matter when we get here, and our ethics are kind of just conditional when we're out there. And then what's going to happen is we're trying to work two different lives together. We'll do what we have to out in the world to take care of our own, to take care of ourselves, to do the right thing, and just whatever it is. And then if we really make mistakes, we get in here on Sunday and we beg God forgiveness because we feel guilty. That's not healthy. I think what we need to do is we need to see that who we are, what's revealed to us about who we are when we gather in worship in God's presence, that begins to shape our calling out in the world, the work that we're called to. Now, for some people, their work is a calling. For some people, work is just a way to earn money, to put food on the table, to provide for the family. And both of those are legitimately sound. This secular and religious division that we live with also makes us think that the only kind of work that you can do to serve God is what I do. That you have to be a preacher, you have to be a pastor, you have to be a whatever it is, you have to be a minister, you have to be a missionary. Otherwise, you're just working over here. It also gives us those weird sort of resentments where people in ministry say, well, if I had a real job, and where people in the real world say, well, I don't get to just, work once a day like you, and then I'm off 6 days. All of that talk is just embittered talk that is created by this poor worldview. It's a much better view when we realize that we are all working together to honor God in whatever it is that we do. And whatever your calling is, you have an opportunity in that to understand how what you do honors God in whatever it is that you do. Because you are those people who are representing Him to the rest of the world, and even more so, we're representing Jesus Christ. So it all goes back to the ground somehow, and we're all cultivating something. Whether we're actually cultivating the earth and growing our own food, or whether we are cultivating a culture that supports one another, a very complex economy, we all have a responsibility. If we're going to get this work and worship, work and rest thing right, what we're going to do is we're going to find ways to do that honor God. But know this, all of us are made for good work. I mean, even Adam and Eve before sin are made for good work. They have a job to do. They have a purpose. They tend to the garden. They tend to the earth. That's their home. That's where they live. They work it, and it works well. When they start to play God, when they start to dehumanize themselves, then the relationship between them and the world, there's consequences. But what defines good work? Well, let's think about that. Because if we do live in these complex economies, what are we going to do? I mean, are we all just going to have to go off and live on a farm somewhere and grow our own food and that's it, and disconnect from a larger economy? Well, that's not realistic. It wasn't even realistic for most of the history of God's people when they lived in cities, when they participated in a lot of different works. I think a better economy, because we all talk about the economy like it has nothing to do with God. Sometimes we talk about the economy. I can remember especially back when the economy wasn't doing so well, when it wasn't healthy, back around 2007, 2008. And we didn't just talk about our economic situation, we spoke of the economy. And I began to recognize at that time that sometimes I and others, we speak about the economy as if it is a force greater than us, almost as if it is a God within itself. That's a power. That's a principality. That's the sort of thing that Paul is writing about when he talks about these powers, these greater than human powers. Now, I'm not saying there's a God of the economy. I'm not saying that there's some intelligence behind it. But I am saying that God's connection to our economy, what we live in, is a lot bigger than just God saying, I'm going to roll the dice today and we'll see if they get a good economy or we'll see if they get a bad economy. I mean, it's all about the market, and it's all about luck, and it's all about big forces. It's all about big numbers. That kind of thinking, again, lures us into pulling God out of these things. When you talk about the stock market, when you talk about the markets that we live in and the governments that we live in, those are just more complicated forms of the human work balanced with human rest. I mean, you want your stock portfolio to do really well. Why? So that you can retire and rest. And sometimes you get to, and sometimes you don't. But if we could understand how to balance our work and our rest in a way that honors God, then we might find ourselves much healthier, happier, doing well. Now, this isn't a success gospel. This is an obedience gospel. That we're understanding what it means to do things the way God intended. And then when we are obedient to Him, we contribute to this better economy. This division and these faulty work ethics we have, they end up turning our day of worship, our first day of the week, they end up turning it into an inconvenient distraction. And that's sad. What I mean by that is we end up turning Sunday into a day where, it's like, there's a lot of things I could do. I could take this day off. I could do a lot of stuff, but got to go to church. Got to be there. Got to take time. Somebody's got duties to do. They've got things to do. We've got to get all this done, but we're doing it so that then when we go to heaven and we get checked in by the judge, he looks at our record. And I think as long as we're about 90% in attendance, we ought to be okay. Now you're sitting there thinking, oh, that's not true. No, it's not true. But watch ourselves that we don't sometimes think like that's true. That we sometimes treat our attendance and our worship as an unnecessary burden. Hey, in a lot of ways it is my job, and I'm going to confess to you I'm guilty of that sometimes. It would be much better if we could see this work as a God-honoring work. One of the old words for worship is liturgy. Okay, you've heard that maybe. What is a liturgy? We usually mean it's an order of worship. But what it literally means is it is the work of the people. That when we gather here on the Lord's Day, and we serve the Lord's Supper, and we attend to God's Word, and we encourage one another in song, and we find other ways to support one another, and we open ourselves up to what God is doing among us. You know that when we do that, we are doing a kind of a work. We're doing a kind of a work that is satisfying and honors God. Now, when the brick-making slaves did that in Egypt, when God took them out of Egypt and they were no longer dehumanized by Egypt, in doing so, God is also saving and redeeming Egypt. Because He cannot allow the people of Egypt to continue to oppress other human beings made in His image, especially the ones who are the heirs of the promise that He gave to Abraham. But Egypt is ruined because of their dehumanizing economy. Let's take a look real quick at Exodus 10:7. Pharaoh's servants came to him and said, "How long will this man be a menace to us? Release the people so that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not know that Egypt is destroyed?" Today in the sermon, I'm going to be bringing you some thoughts from the text of 1 Samuel 7. And the Philistines figure out, leading up to that story and after that story, the Philistines figure out that when you go up against God's people and you dehumanize them, there are consequences. And by the time of Samuel, that story is being told. Here, the people of Egypt, the leaders of Egypt, are telling Pharaoh, we've got to let these people go or God is going to ruin us. Now you ask yourself, why would they want to hold on to it? Because their economy is vested in those brick-making slaves. If you lose the brick-making slaves, who will make the bricks? And if nobody's making bricks, then what happens to Egypt? The problem is God says the way you've got your economy set up, Pharaoh, is an ungodly economy. It's not allowed. So it does us well to make sure that the economies that we are connected to honor God, and they will honor God by honoring other people. Otherwise, we may find that God has a real problem with our economy, and He will redeem it. Because everything like that is going to have to be obedient to God. If it's not obedient to God, it will be obedient to God when it collapses or when God overrules it. You see, when the judgment comes, folks, y'all understand this, right? When the judgment comes, it's not just you and I that are subject to judgment. In fact, if we've trusted in Jesus Christ, then we're good. It's almost like I'm not just saying we're good, we can do whatever we want. I'm saying at the moment of judgment, we're good. It's like we get put into a fast track line where it says, Jesus is there saying, these are mine. I've taken care of them. They've been obedient to me. Okay, now that's where I want to be. But all of these other, it's not just human beings, but it's all of these other things, these governments, these powers, these institutions that claim to have godlike authority, they are going to be judged as well. Now, I'm not talking about some cosmic drama where God is up on a judge's bench, going, okay, bring the economy before me. I'm saying that in God's end-time action, those things will be judged because they will not be allowed to exist if they set themselves up as antagonistic to God. So a lot of these things that we find ourselves concerned about, and rightly so, about our government or any other government when it doesn't honor God, it's right for us to be concerned, but always be assured of this. Those powers, those institutions will never get the last word. Only God gets the last word. That's what we were learning if you were in this class on Revelation. Is that even though things may be bad for a while, God gets the final word. And that these things fall. The dragon and his beasts and all those false governments, they don't last. No. They get taken down, and they get taken down quickly. I should have put this slide before that last one. The word economy, you can trace it back to the Greek. It just means one who manages a household. So if you want to do this, we can think of our small economies, our economy right here, the way that we do business with people, the way you manage your household affairs. It's a house manager. The way we manage the world is a lot like Adam and Eve who had a garden. So, there's one level that this can be so big that we think, boy, there ain't no way. How am I going to affect the world economy in 2021 when it is so complex? Well, I don't have to worry about that. I just have to think about my dealings. Am I being fair to people? Am I taking advantage of people? I had a man who was a friend of mine. He was struggling to overcome drugs and alcohol, and he was trying to find a way to work. He's passed on a few years now, but I remember one of the toughest days for him, and it was still his responsibility to manage his own recovery, but one of the toughest days for him was when he worked for someone that he thought was a Christian brother, and that person cheated him. And you see, even in those simple things, we can contribute to a bad economy. And I really thought my friend was going to lose his sobriety. He was close. Because it allowed him to go back to a way of thinking where he said, this is what always happens to you. You try to do good, and then people who claim that they're good, they cheat you. And he wasn't paid that day. I couldn't intervene because I didn't know the other party. All I could do was support my friend and just say, you have a choice to make today. But still, you look at those situations and you realize That's not fair. That's bad economy. Now, it can be complex, but we can work out problems with one another and with the help of others. Jesus has taught us how to do that. So we don't have to think bigger than our own household and our own community. Start with the small stuff. That's all God's calling us to just do what we can. When we think about this and we think about our house, whether that's literally our household structure, if you're parents, you're managing the economy of your house, the children. I mean, if you tell the children, hey, I don't want you spending money on this stuff, and then you go out and spend money on things that you don't need, well, is that fair? If husband and wife are disagreeing over what gets spent, I mean, there's all these things. But it's not just the money, it's the way we spend our time there. It's the way we do things. I mean, we got to think, do we go to our house and are we 6 days on and 1 day off? Or are we just working all the time, and so I might as well not even be home? Ask yourself these little questions, and maybe it'll help you practically. Who's the Pharaoh in your economy? The Pharaoh is going to be the force that dehumanizes you. The Pharaoh is going to be the whatever it is that makes you think that makes you work too hard or makes you work all the time, or it's going to be the force that says everything that needs to be done has to be done because I'm in charge. Now, you might find out that you're Pharaoh sometimes. That's fine. Don't be afraid. Own it, confess it, take it to God, okay? Because remember, Pharaoh does not have to end up getting hit by the plagues. At any point, he could have relented and said, God, you are God. If Pharaoh had done a Nebuchadnezzar, you know what I'm talking about, from the book of Daniel, and realized God is God and I am not, things could have gone a lot better for Pharaoh in Egypt. What's the empire in our economy? What is it in our economy that has to be supported that it would even resort to having slaves make bricks? Now, you can think of that on the large scale, or you can think of that on the small scale. And then consider the basis of your principles. In what you do, does it value humans simply for being human? Does it value you for simply being human? Or have you set up expectations that demand that you must be godlike in your activity or in whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish or in your responsibility? Or can you simply be human and say, I'm just going to be obedient and trust in God? He'll be God in all of my affairs and all of my doings. And then ask yourself, is this somehow going to worship God? Is it going to glorify God? Again, get away from the religious and secular kind of thinking that says, well, this is secular, so it doesn't matter. No. Just think about it in simple terms. One of the simplest views of the economy is many of us will leave here today and we'll go out and we'll participate in the economy by buying lunch somewhere. We'll go out and eat. Now, when you do that, ask yourself, are we valuing people? Are we worshiping God? I'll tell you a little story to wrap it up and tell you why this matters so much. When I was ministering at the church in Lake Jackson, one of our favorite places to go was, there was a place there called Cafe Laredo. Oh, they made their own tortillas. It was just fantastic. Everybody would go to Cafe Laredo on a Sunday afternoon. Whole town of Lake Jackson. Everybody from all the 4 churches that existed there on Church Row. There was I don't know what her actual title was. Her name, anyway, her name's Tracy. She's a friend of mine. She doesn't mind for that. But anyway, it was, I called her the maitre d'. I don't know if that was correct or not, but she was the one that would greet you and she would take care of everything when you got there. Weeks later, she asked for an appointment to come talk to me at the office, and she says, hey, listen, I want to tell you some things. She said, all service folks, all waiters and waitresses, the one day that they hate to work is Sunday. Because on Sunday, these so-called Christians show up and they are rude and they are nasty and they are upset. They've been preached at and scolded and condemned for an hour, and they're angry and they're mad, and some of them have been the ones doing the scolding and the condemning. She says, we hate to work on Sundays. She said, I want to tell you something. Your people have been coming to my restaurant. I thought, oh no, here we go. I'm going to have to get a list of names, I guess, She said, your people are different. They come in here and they ask how I'm doing. They come in here and they care about what's going on in my life. Some of them have asked me about my children and what they can do to help. She said, I haven't thought much about being a follower of Jesus, but I see them and I want to be a follower of Jesus. I baptized Tracy weeks after that, all because people contributed to a healthy, God-honoring economy. Now, don't you think you can do the same? I know you can. I know you can. And I want to encourage you to do that. Let us give thanks. Father, we ask that you would teach us how to be God-honoring people, not just for our sake, but for the sake of the world that you love, for the people that you love, for the creation that you gave us as a gift. Father, teach us every day to enjoy the beautiful gifts that you've given us and let us never take it for granted. Food, air, water, sunlight. The creatures that we live on this earth with, who help us, who feed us, who help us survive. Father, I pray that you would ask us to think about these things. And in all of this, let us turn back to you and be obedient. Father, I pray that you'd bless everyone who's hearing this message, everyone who is here today, that you will make them agents of your godly work and give them godly rest today so that they can be the people who bless others in your name. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, we'll get started.